from 1936 to 1941, and there was actually one other country that the Europeans never seemed to get their hands on, and that of course being the West African nation of Liberia. Now, Liberia was never a European colony, but Liberia was still a product of colonialism deeply linked to the country of the United States, and can be considered to be the first and only colony founded by Black Americans. Nearly everyone is well aware of the history of Black Americans, a group which arguably makes up one of the largest single ethnicities in the United States, and are a conglomeration of many different peoples from many regions of Africa, molded and shaped over hundreds of years through shared struggles and values. Ever since the first African arrived in the North American colonies in the early 1600s, the populace had always been split on the issue of slavery and free Africans in American society. Many northern whites saw abolition as inevitable and wished for a resolution for the soon-to-be millions of freed slaves that didn't result in competition with native-born whites, and thus the American Colonial Society, or ACS, was born. With the express purpose of repatriating North American blacks away from the United States. In 1816, the ACS received support from many different personalities from across the political and social spectrum. Some of these abolitionists and members of the American Colonial Society had their own personal vendettas for supporting and funding such projects, such as Henry Clay and other Southern Democrats, while others had truly altruistic motives, such as the highly religious Quakers, who saw the treatment of Native Americans and blacks as a moral abomination. After several failed expeditions to the coast of West Africa, the ACS settled on the windward coast due to its relatively close proximity to the United States when compared to other areas of Africa, its moderate climate, which is somewhat comparable to the southern U.S., and because no other European power had yet claimed the land. Other proposals on where to send free blacks and emancipated slaves sought a more convenient route, such as the Caribbean island of Hispaniola or Central America, and although not much came from these, a small community of American blacks settled on the Samana Peninsula in the Dominican Republic and still exists to this day. After 1821, small numbers of free people of color and emancipated blacks arrived in the windward coast, which became Liberia, with the largest settlement becoming Monrovia, named after the U.S. President James Monroe, who had strongly supported the ACS. For the next few decades, Monrovia and other American settlements were de facto territories of the United States, being a small, albeit important bastion of American values and culture, with the newly arrived American blacks being just as much strangers in this land as any white American was. They began to form their own political identity and ethnic consciousness based on individualism, civil liberties, and classical liberalism, although even among the American settlers, a class division emerged between the free people of color, who were mostly mulattoes with significant European ancestry, and the emancipated black American slaves, although both of these groups were collectively known as the Americo-Liberians. After Liberian independence in 1847, the mulattoes mostly favored the Republican Party of Liberia, which stressed anti-identitarian progressive values, while the emancipated blacks favored the Liberian Whig Party, which heavily leaned towards nationalism and other conservative ideologies. Although after 1878, Liberia effectively transformed into a one-party state, with the true Whig Party dominating Liberian politics for over a century. Directly after the American Civil War in 1865, the issue of the nearly 4 million newly emancipated American blacks was brought to a head in American politics, and opinions varied greatly even among the same demographic or political party. There never was any state-sponsored forced relocation program for freed blacks, but certain incentives were offered by the U.S. government to relocate to Liberia, and migration boomed for a short period, and in many cases these self-proclaimed black settlers had as little as 1/16 African ancestry, yet because of their slave heritage, however minute, they still faced discrimination. Regardless of genetics or political affiliation, most Americo-Liberians regarded themselves as more sophisticated and civilized than the indigenous West African tribes of Liberia, and hence a massive rift developed between the former and the latter, and very similarly to South Africa, Liberia was dominated by an elite minority for over a century up until relatively recently. In South Africa, they were the Afrikaners, and in the case of Liberia, they were the Americo-Liberians, and and also in both cases there was a severe backlash against the previously ruling class, with both becoming a quickly shrinking minority. Liberia was considered a strong American ally and one of the United States' most important overseas assets in the past, as throughout the various administrations, the U.S. government had poured billions of dollars into developing Liberian infrastructure, especially during the Cold War, when many other West African nations had turned to communism or socialism in the wake of anti-Western sentiment following European colonialism. This set the stage for the Liberian Civil Wars, plural, two of the most deadly conflicts in all of African history, with almost 20% of the Liberian population perishing during or directly after the war, either as a direct casualty of violence or from starvation brought about by the destruction of infrastructure. Although economic development and international relations were remarkably stable and positive during the period of true Whig dominance, the indigenous West African populace was still widely disenfranchised, and Samuel Doe took the mantle of first Liberian president of native Liberian descent in 1980 after he led a military coup assassinating President William Tolbert and effectively ran a military dictatorship until the First Liberian Civil War in 1989, when he was kidnapped and tortured by members of the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, all the while being filmed up until his merciless and grisly demise, public execution by decapitation. This brutal display of sadism set the stage for the next 2 decades of destabilization and turmoil in the nation of Liberia, as various groups viciously fought for power in this West African nation, and the Americo-Liberians' monopoly on politics dissolved almost overnight. Although Liberia was historically one of the most economically prosperous in Africa, ever since the Liberian Civil Wars, combined with other natural disasters such as the AIDS epidemic and Ebola outbreaks, the country has experienced one of the steepest declines in economic growth, life expectancy, and standards of living in all of history. And interestingly, Prince Johnson, one of the men partially responsible for the kidnapping, torture, and public execution of Samuel Doe, still serves as Liberian senator to this day. Americo-Liberians only make up about 2 to perhaps no more than 5% of the Liberian population, although when including the descendants of those from the Caribbean, this percentage may double. However, this is a far cry from nearly 10% Americo-Liberian in 1980, and even higher than that in the past. This is due to a variety of factors, notably a much higher emigration rate, as being better off financially allows Americo-Liberians an easier chance to escape the chaos, as well as a considerably lower birth rate than that of other West African ethnicities in Liberia because of their urban, centralized nature, and lastly due to intermarriage with other groups in Liberia, which has become increasingly common in recent times. Another group that is remarkably similar in history and culture to the Americo-Liberians are the Sierra Leone Creoles of the neighboring country of Sierra Leone, which was also established as a colony for former African slaves by the United Kingdom, and Creoles also make up about 2 to 5% of Sierra Leone's population in the present day. Unlike the Americans, the British kept Sierra Leone as an overseas colony, not gaining full autonomy until 1961, and following in the footsteps of Liberia, Sierra Leone was embroiled in a civil war in the 1990s and had been mired with poverty, disease, and economic collapse ever since. Other former slaves and free blacks from the United States and other European colonies, including the Caribbean and Brazil, settled in many other parts of West Africa, including Nigeria, Ghana, and Bioko Island in Equatorial Guinea, with many reassimilating into the dominant African culture, while others have still maintained a unique identity. The Americo-Liberian culture is in many ways derivative of 19th century antebellum southern United States, with many of the colonists coming from places such as Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, or Georgia, as well as having a strong Caribbean vibe from other settlers from Barbados or Jamaica that integrated with the Americo-Liberian population. They are a fascinating contribution to Liberia today and still convey many of the ideologies and principles that America was founded on. So again, I have to ask, did America ever have an empire? Please let me know your thoughts on the rise and tragedy